What's up, guys? What you are about to listen to is the introduction to a book I wrote called Farther Along, Meditations on the Book of Ecclesiastes. If you like what you hear, we ask that you consider grabbing the book on Amazon, and we ask that you share this content on social media. You're welcome. Introduction: The Game of Life. Do you have time to play the game of life? I heard these words ring out from our living room as my youngest son asked his aunt for one last game before they would make their long journey home to the Great White North. I believe the first edition of the game was actually introduced in the 1860s, but the game, as we know it today, was popularized in the 1960s and has since seen several new editions. Of course, the manufacturers had to adjust for inflation and add amazing new vocations such as community organizer, making 7 figures, and the ever-popular gender studies professor. I made up that last part, but it's probably worth a Google. Truth be told, I've only played the game once, in part because I get bored easily, and in part because it's a stupid game and it doesn't mimic life at all. Not only does it see children as a liability instead of an asset, but it also sees college as a net gain instead of a net loss. Not to mention the fact that there are no unexpected terminal illness cards. There are no cancer cards or unemployment cards. There are no church split cards or rapid inflation cards. There are no unable to retire cards or my business partner embezzled all of our resources cards. There are no hit by a drunk driver cards. And there are no oops, we elected a communist cards. But like I said, I've only played the game once. The one time I did play the game, I made the mistake of asking what the point of the game was. Apparently, it is to die with the most stuff. After all, it is an American game. At the beginning of the game, I reminded my children that this game would end the same for all of us, that is, in death, and that all we acquired would just be redistributed to the next participants of the game. It was a very dark morning. After a couple of my children cried, they came to accept their fate. We spent the rest of the day reading Nietzsche and sitting in the dark. Did I mention the game was a gift that was given on Christmas morning? However, it all worked out because Bob Cratchit showed up with his sickly son to remind us of the goodness of humanity, and then we all lived happily ever after. God bless us, everyone. Of course, the specific details of this story have been altered a little bit. I'll let you decide which little and which bit. Either way, the entirety of my story is still far more believable than Joe Biden getting 81 million votes. My point being, and yes, I do have one, is that the game of life is a lie, or at least woefully deficient. I guess we could begin by saying that life is not a game at all. It's a gift. But if we can all admit that the game of life is deficient because it is not reflective of reality, and yet no one wants to play a game filled with hardship, tragedy, and injustice, then how in the world can we actually call actual life a gift? At least gifts, as we know them, are somewhat predictable. That is, this is what you want and or need, and the giver usually factors that into the equation set by the parameters of their budget, and then gifts accordingly. In this equation, everyone ends up with varying levels of nice, neat, and predictable satisfaction. Every once in a while there is a pleasant surprise, and if not, there is always the return. We save our receipts for a reason, right? However, life, the real thing, is anything but predictable, and the more we try to control every aspect of it, the more we find ourselves increasingly dissatisfied and unproductive. The actual game of life, the one that we said was a gift, when opened, is more like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. That may sound well and good until your box is filled with the flavors nobody wants, which is bad enough until you see your neighbor's box filled with all the caramels. That's just not cool. Maybe life is more like the game of life than we care to admit. You just draw the card in front of you, and you have to play the hand that you're dealt. Some of us get all the caramels, and some of us get the mystery flavors. That's just the way that it is, and there is no changing the rules of the game. But if this is the case, Why is it that some who get all of the caramels, myriads upon myriads of caramels, are the most depressed? They have drawn every good card that's on the board, and they are sitting in the dark reading Nietzsche, waiting for death while doing their level best to make sure everyone else is as miserable as they are before they die. All this while our little crippled friend, with his one little chocolate, which isn't even really a flavor or even actually anything that resembles chocolate, is praising God and blessing everyone. How do we make sense of any of this? Is there sense to be made of any of this? Maybe. If life is truly a gift with all of the apparent madness and incongruities, then the key to making sense of the gift wouldn't be found in the gift itself, but rather in the one that gave it. Maybe knowledge of the giver is the only way to truly understand and make sense out of the gift. After all, apart from that, wouldn't our angsty existentialism and plucky optimism both be equally right and equally wrong? Maybe our real problem is that of perspective. Maybe Kenny Rogers was right when he said, "Every hand is a winner, and every hand is a loser, and the best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep." Studying Ecclesiastes. I love the book of Ecclesiastes. It has the distinct privilege of being the only book of the Bible that makes you dumber every time you read it. There is no doubt that Ecclesiastes can be a difficult book. Christians can't agree on anything, but all can agree that Ecclesiastes can be a difficult book. Greg Bartholomew says, Ecclesiastes is a lot like an octopus. Just when you think you have all the tentacles under control, that is, you have understood the book, there is one waving about in the air. Perhaps going a step further, Douglas Sean O'Donnell comments, Ecclesiastes is like a 1,000-piece puzzle taken from the box, thrown on the floor, and kicked around by the kids. End quote. For many, if not most, the book of Ecclesiastes is an enigma packaged as a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, and then placed in some Russian dolls before it's locked up in Pandora's box. Jeffrey Myers says, quote, the book as a whole remains for many an incomprehensible mystery, a huge conundrum smack in the middle of Holy Scripture. Philip Ryken concludes, it is not the kind of book that we keep reading until we reach the end and get the answer, like a mystery. Instead, it is a book in which we keep struggling with the problems of life, and as we struggle, we learn to trust God with the questions even when we do not have all of the answers. End quote. Heck, the author of Ecclesiastes himself says, my son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Ecclesiastes 12:12. All of this is not very encouraging. It's like inviting someone to go on a journey, the destination of which you will never arrive at, but you can rest assured that the trip will be worth it because you are going to have several painful stops along the way. Oh yeah, and Jesus loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Furthermore, to make matters worse, Ecclesiastes is known as part of the wisdom literature in the Scriptures. Certainly, you would think that reading literature that is categorized as wisdom would make you, well, wise, right? Yet Ecclesiastes, right up there with the book of Job, has a way of destroying and laying to waste any nice, neat, systematic categories that we want to apply to the world to help us understand it and our place in it. It is true that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. However, this is not an end in and of itself. This is not a one-and-done kind of thing, like, I fear God, therefore I have now acquired wisdom. The fear of the Lord, then, is the beginning, middle, and end of wisdom. The fear of the Lord enables you to make wise decisions in real time. Wisdom has to be applied. She is known by her children. There are times to make a fool look like a fool, and there are times to let the fool expose himself, and wisdom shows you the way. However, life under the sun isn't put together with 2x4s, and like an old house, nothing is square or level. Anyone that has worked on an old house knows that sometimes when you try really hard to level something, you just make everything else look worse. On the surface, more often than not, The words that ring out from Ecclesiastes are perplexing, if not outright haunting. The author is merciless and relentless in the questions he asks and seems to be completely unfamiliar, or at least doesn't care about, all of our nice evangelical categories. Even though Ecclesiastes is sacred canon, the author of all people should know that there are things that we just don't talk about in the church. Maybe this is why I've never seen Ecclesiastes 2:17 on a coffee mug. So I hated life. The preacher. I think this is one of the reasons why I love Ecclesiastes so much. Truth be told, this book holds a special place in my heart. I didn't grow up in the church, and perhaps one of the best words to describe my upbringing would be train wreck. Perhaps the best way to describe my lifestyle before Christ would be that I was a pagan of pagans. However, I wasn't so pagan that I wouldn't go to church if somebody invited me. I was at least a sensible pagan. Long story short, I did go when I was invited, and I found what I wasn't looking for. Through the preaching of the word, I was broken and convicted of my sin. Up to this point in my life, I had several questions about Jesus. He was an enigma to me. The fully God, while also being fully man thing, was always perplexing, but the thing that always seemed to trip me up was his power. I had gotten to the point where I would grant that Jesus was who he said he was, but I thought, if he was truly the Son of God and was all-powerful, why not just destroy all of his enemies? That seemed like the logical thing to do, until I understood why he didn't. One Sunday morning, I just got lost in my own mind during the sermon. I could see Jesus on the cross. I could see all of the hatred and scorn against him. I could see how mutilated he was. I thought, get down, just get down. Why won't you get down and destroy all of these people? Why won't you just make everything right? Then grace hit me like a freight train. The reason Jesus didn't get down was because of me. The reason he was on the cross was because of me. It was my sin that put him there, and it was his love for me that kept him there. Obviously, it wasn't only about me, but I was now raptured up into this magnificent story of redeeming love. I didn't understand everything at this point. In fact, it is embarrassing how very little I did understand. But what I understood, I was all in. After bawling my eyes out, I thought I should give my life to Christ, be baptized, stop sleeping with my girlfriend, and start reading the Bible. So I did. When I started reading the Bible, it was so confusing to me, and I had so many questions. I would jump all over the place and was so messed up on timelines and who was who and what was what. At one point, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I even went to the local library and rented every Bible movie they had available thinking that might help. It didn't. All of this should stress the importance of being at a good church. However, if you don't know anything, you don't know what you don't know, which means you don't really know where to begin. Like, for starters, what is a good church? Then one day I read Ecclesiastes. It was confusing. It was difficult. There were things that seemed contradictory, and yet reading it felt familiar. Strangely, it made sense. I felt like I was sitting next to a mysterious old gambler on a train bound for nowhere, and he was about to give me an education as we smoked cigars and drank whiskey. What I read was raw, real, and honest. It seemed so much weightier than all of the church culture that I had been exposed to at this point in my life, which seemed clueless about the world, or they wanted to be like it, or just a little bit. Jesus and life in this messed up world seemed so weighty, and yet if the church were a food, it would be a rice cake. I don't know if you remember those things from the 80s, but I am not even sure that can be categorized as food. The point being, they were completely devoid of substance. But the preacher I met in Ecclesiastes was different. He had weight. Ecclesiastes not only destroys any notion of secular utopianism, but also all forms of evangelical triteness and respectability. The church seemed to be just as vacuous as everything else. I think this is why Herman Melville called Ecclesiastes the truest of all books. After this preacher drank up the last of my whiskey and smoked my last cigar, It got real quick. The knight got deadly silent, and his face lost all expression, and he said to me, "If you're going to play the game, boy, you got to learn to play it right." It is true. If you want to play the game of life, you've got to learn to play it right. If we want to learn how to live life, we've got to learn to live it right. The preacher is going to teach us how to live it right in a fallen world where things often don't make sense at all. To alleviate that confusion and to not make dirty water clear as mud, we have to learn how to read it right, which is to say that understanding some things on the front end will clear up a lot of confusion for us along the way. The words of the preacher have tripped up many an unsuspecting traveler and left them depressed and in need of their therapy hamster. Contrary to what many believe about Ecclesiastes, it is not a negative book, but rather is overwhelmingly positive. This is a book that shows us how to find substance in a world filled with shadows. It shows us how to find lasting joy in a world where everything slips through our fingers. The only catch is that in order to get to that point, we have to be brought to the end of our tether. Therefore, the preacher's objective is to tear down just as much as it is to build up. Or rather, it is to destroy so that we are finally ready to build something that lasts. Derek Kidner describes it this way. He is demolishing to build. The searching questions he has asked are those that life itself puts to us if we will only listen. He can afford to ask them because in the final chapters he has good news for us. Once we can stop pretending that what is mortal is enough for us, who have been given a capacity for the eternal. It is news, paradoxically, of judgment. Kidner continues, the function of Ecclesiastes is to bring us to the point where we begin to fear that such a comment is the only honest one. So it is. If everything is dying, we face the appalling inference that nothing has meaning, nothing matters under the sun. It is then that we can hear, as the good news which it is, that everything matters, for God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. That is how the book will end. On this rock we can be destroyed, but it is rock, not quicksand. There is the chance to build. End quote. In order to get us to this point, however, he has to be unapologetically honest. This means that we must bury all of our falsehoods, pretenses, and churchiness as we read it. Pointing this out, Zach Swine writes, it is as if the preacher causes us to put off our religious personas and get honest about our being human in a fallen world. We feel our lament in his pain. We see our own tantrums in his frustrations. We touch our own longings as he cries out with his. The preacher gives language to our aches, poetry for our dreams, and exclamation for our search. He resists anything trite, pretentious, sentimental, or dishonest. By this means, the God who inspired this text shows us his empathy and his profound understanding of our plight in all of its confusing, emotional, tragic, and maddening forms. End quote. To read Ecclesiastes honestly, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. We have to be willing to wrestle with things that don't make sense and to receive things that don't fit into our paradigms. Life truly is a gift from God, and God's gifts to us are not the problem, but rather we are and the way we use them. This means that we can have everything and yet possess nothing, a point that we will come to see was true for our preacher. If we had to typify Ecclesiastes as a song, we would say it sounds a lot more like Johnny Cash's version of Hurt than anything that we hear on Christian radio. The preacher doesn't remove joy from the equation like some angsty college freshman wired just a little too tightly with 1 year of philosophy under his belt. Rather, he removes triviality from the equation so that we may have true joy. This is why Sidney Greidanus likens Ecclesiastes to a Rembrandt painting where the dark background draws all of your attention to the light. We have to see the emptiness of everything under the sun so that we receive the fullness of God, who stands over it and has ordained all of it. Herein lies one of our major frustrations, not just with Ecclesiastes, but with life in general. That is, it is not the absence of God that challenges us, but rather his presence. Otherwise, all of our frustration with the way things are and with their apparent futility would make no sense. Our problem isn't that we are stuck on a treadmill or in the proverbial hamster wheel, or if you prefer to be more philosophical, like Sisyphus cursed forever to push a boulder uphill. Like the Smashing Pumpkins said, despite all my rage, I am still just a rat in a cage. No, our problems and frustrations don't just stem from the existence of those things without God. If that were the case, there would be no point in complaining about anything because there would be no way of knowing how things are supposed to be. Everything would just be. No, our problem is that God is sovereign over all of it, and yet we still experience all of it. Where is the joy in that? Well, the preacher is going to tell us as we work through the pages of this book. However, before we do that, it would be helpful to know who this preacher is. The first question that probably comes into your mind when you read the book of Ecclesiastes is why in the world this book is called Ecclesiastes. I'm not ashamed to admit that I may have had that thought a time or two. Let's be honest, it's kind of a weird name. I always thought it was some foreign word that was above my pay grade. I was partially correct. The root word for Koheleth, which is the word that we translate as preacher, literally means to gather, collect, or assemble, which is why it was translated with the word ekklesia in the Greek, which is also where we get our word for church, ekklesia meaning congregation or gathering. All this to say that it's not really a term or title that is easy for us to nail down. It is really much broader than we are comfortable with and can be translated as preacher, teacher, assembler, philosopher, president, professor, or gatherer. Most translations use the term preacher, so I'll stick with that. This leads us to the next question. Who is this preacher? The book of Proverbs begins in the following way. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. One can very easily see the similarity between this and the opening words of Ecclesiastes, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Some think that it is weird that Solomon would not identify himself in the opening words of Ecclesiastes. This, coupled with what they believe to be other tensions within the text, leads them to conclude that it was someone channeling his inner Solomon, or potentially two people channeling their inner Solomon. There is a bit more to it than that, but that is really the gist of it. I agree with Doug Wilson when he says there is, quote, no conclusive reason not to attribute the book to Solomon, end quote. Philip Ryken writes, from the earliest days of the church, many teachers have identified Solomon as the preacher. After wandering away from the Lord and falling into tragic sin, Solomon repented of his sinful ways and returned to the right and proper fear of God. Ecclesiastes is his memoir, an autobiographical account of what he learned from his futile attempt to live without God. In effect, the book is his final testament, written perhaps to steer his own son Rehoboam in the right spiritual direction. End quote. Solomon did fall into great apostasy as described in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to them in love. He had 700 wives, who were princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. All this to say that I believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes after repenting of his sin later in life in what Ryken described as an autobiographical account of what he learned from his futile attempt to live without God. Solomon is speaking as a wise shepherd king, seeking to impart his wisdom to the people of God, but more practically to his sons who will take over the kingdom. His goal, then, is that they would fear God and stay the course and steer clear of his errors, somewhat like a loving father warning his son where all the brick walls are. He knows because he has hit them all. At the end of his life, he can see more clearly where true joy is to be found, and it certainly is not to be found driving into brick walls. What then is the purpose of Ecclesiastes? Michael Eaton answers this question in the following way. It is an essay in apologetics. It defends the life of faith in a generous God by pointing to the grimness of the alternative. He continues, The preacher wishes to deliver us from a rosy-colored, self-confident, godless life, with its inevitable cynicism and bitterness, and from trusting in wisdom, pleasure, wealth, and human justice or integrity. He wishes to drive us to see that God is there, that he is good and generous, and that only such an outlook makes life coherent and fulfilling. This is all true and well and good. Many, if not most, would define Ecclesiastes as an apologetic book, showing us the emptiness of pursuing anything in this life as an ultimate end apart from God. However, this is also an apologetic for a joy-filled life. Solomon isn't a killjoy. He isn't just telling us of the futility of everything, as if to preach the shortest sermon ever. Life sucks and then you die. And oh yeah, you should really fear the God that made everything suck. Amen, and go in peace. In order to see the true light that burns in the room, sometimes all the artificial lights need to be turned off. This is what Solomon does, and as we will see, he is the perfect person to do this.